Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Russell, Vice President, Community Engagement and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for WTTW and WFMT, and welcome to today's Chicago Tonight Voices, a WTTW News Community Conversation. WTTW is committed to producing and presenting trusted best-in-class content fueled by distinctly Chicago sensibility. We have served as Chicago's window to the world, and our purpose is to enrich lives, engage communities, and inspire exploration. Today is a special Voices conversation focused on WTTW News and Chicago Tonight special coverage, A Safer City. As part of our special coverage, we are taking a deep dive into neighborhood crime, violence, and public safety as residents, policymakers, and community groups work to address the growing issue. For dedicated coverage, watch Chicago Tonight and find ongoing and extensive data and investigative reporting on the WTTW News website. WTTW's special coverage of A Safer City is supported by the Su Ling Jing Charitable Foundation Initiative for Reducing Violence in Chicago. The generous support of donors, sponsors, and WTTW members and viewers like you make it possible for WTTW to bring provocative ideas to life, to tackle the issues that matter, and to expand our perspectives on the world in which we live. There's only one reason why this is possible, and that reason is you. Thank you for your support. Now, before our host, Joanna Hernandez, moderates today's conversation, please watch a clip of Lisa Daniels' firsthand gun violence talk.
My license plate frame reads, he was my son, and his name was Darren. In the summer of 2012, I got a phone call that no mother ever wants to receive. Darren had been killed in a drug deal that had gone awry. It started out as a robbery, and shots were fired. And when the dust cleared, my son's body laid in the driveway. The next day, a newspaper article in the local newspaper, Southtown Star, ran a headline that said, "Man from Park Forest shot to death, had felony and weapon convictions." And it wasn't until the second paragraph of that actual article that they actually referred to my son by his name. I found that amazing. I found it troubling. Nothing that was written in that article was inaccurate. But what I knew was that it was incomplete. Just like many newspaper articles that share the stories of the experiences of violence in the communities, typically identify young Black youth as gang involved, or they feel it necessary to bring to the forefront that this person had a criminal background. And I felt as though it was imperative to reclaim Darren's narrative in that particular instance of his life. And what I understand about the power of stories is that they may not change or eliminate gun violence, or any kind of violence for that matter, at least not immediately. But here's what they do. Here's what they will do. They establish human connection. They create a space for us to heal and to become connected by our experiences. And when we do that, we position ourselves to know one another in a way that we've never known each other before. And we understand that we are all more alike than we could ever possibly be different. And then we look at each other differently. And then we begin to treat each other differently. And so what I know is that the shortest distance between any two people is a story. Thank you.
And hello, everyone, and welcome to Chicago Tonight. Voices, a WTTW News Community Conversation. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joanna Hernandez, the host of Chicago Tonight, Latino Voices. Now, in 2021, Governor J.B. Pritzker declared gun violence a public health crisis, creating the Reimagined Public Safety Act to bring together community groups, researchers, and public officials to find a collaborative approach to addressing the root causes of gun violence. Today, we take a deeper look at similar efforts to understand its impact and what they have learned. This is part of our WTTW News, a Safer City initiative, which is diving deep into neighborhood crime, violence, and public safety as residents, policymakers, and community groups work to address this growing issue. Now, we're all in listen mode, but that doesn't mean you can't be part of the conversation. We want to hear from you. So please chime in on the chat function with your questions and comments. I'll be sure to share those comments with our guest. Now let's start by introducing them. We have Lisa Daniels, the founder of Darren B. Easterling Center for Restorative Practices, Kathryn Bocanegra, assistant professor at UIC Jane Addams College of Social Work, and Quiwana Bell, the assistant secretary of Firearm Violence Prevention at the state of Illinois. Thank you everyone for joining us. Now this is a very powerful conversation. Kathryn, we have actually done stories together, so it's so nice to bring everybody in one room. Lisa, I want to start with you. It's been 12 years since your son Darren was killed. Can you just tell us a little bit about what that experience is like for someone?
I can tell you what it's like for me. It is a lot of different things, and it's different things for different people. To say that it's anything other than earth-shattering would be an underestimate. It changed the entire trajectory of my life from that day to this. I am not the same person that I was before Darren died, and I continue to evolve as I continue to grow. But I always like to say that I have discovered the best version of myself on the other side of the worst thing that I've ever experienced. Yeah, and I'm not sure if I can do, again, anybody else's experience any justice. I can only speak for mine and how I've learned to navigate life after the loss of Darren, and what that looks like for me. But yeah, I think at the very minimum, what this experience does for anyone who has it is it changes the entire trajectory of your life.
Lisa, who would you say that you are now?
I am an advocate. I am a healer. I am a believer in pain transformation. That is probably the catalyst for the work that I do. I am a prison abolitionist, and I am still a grandmother and a mother. I am still Darren's mother, and in the work that I do on a day-to-day basis, I am mothering my son. I am rewriting his narrative. I am redefining his legacy, and in the midst of all of that, I get the opportunity, and I consider it an absolute blessing, to connect with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people across the state and across the country. And I get to do that and get to exemplify for them what pain transformation looks like and what repairing the harm could potentially look like in the lives of those who have been both victims and victimizers at one point in their life. And I get to do that, and I love it. I absolutely positively love being able to do what I do and be who I am today.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're
Kathryn,
welcome.
you also work very closely with victims of gun violence. Can you just tell me what role does supporting the victims and healing trauma in communities play in ending gun violence?
Absolutely. And a pleasure to be here with you again, Joanna, and to be on the panel with Lisa and Quiwana. I'm actually going to borrow some of Lisa's words, and she can properly credit them to a gentleman who she met in one of our state penal institutions, which is, until we are all healed, none of us are safe. And Lisa, do you want to credit those words appropriately?
Carvassier Smith.
Thank you, Lisa. So Lisa shared those words with me, and it struck me that victim services or supporting survivors of violence is violence prevention. It is ending the cyclical aspect of urban gun violence. And so in providing necessary supports to those who survived a shooting or family members of homicide victims, and continuing those supports in a meaningful way, not just a short dose of support in the immediate aftermath of an incident of violence, we're actually making communities safer.
And Kathryn, what would you say that healing looks like?
Great question. So again, echoing some of Lisa's earlier words, that it can be different things to different people. However, they should be provided the space for their authentic voice and experience to be acknowledged. I think for a long period of time, what healing has been, how healing has been constructed for survivors is in the form of punishment. And when I say punishment, it is as long as we find the individual responsible for the harm that you experienced or your loved one experienced, then you will feel better at the end of that course of action through identifying them, arresting them, and then knowing that they'll spend the rest of their life in prison. But overwhelmingly research now, especially research that authentically engages the experience and voices of survivors, is telling us that that may not provide any relief at all or a minimal level of relief to survivors. Survivors do want accountability, but that accountability should be in dialogue and led by survivors. It should be in conversation with all of those who have been harmed. And there's a potential for that to be restorative through restorative justice efforts. It should be trauma responsive, as Lisa said, it should be healing centered. And it will not occur in the first week, 3 months, or even year in the aftermath. So we need to think about a long-term marathon of healing in Chicago with continual investments in those who are leading the efforts, who I believe should be the survivors themselves.
Thank you for that. And Quiwana, your office was established as part of Governor Pritzker's Reimagine Public Safety Act. What role has the office had in the efforts to fight gun violence in this short time?
Yeah, so thank you for having me here today, and thank you, Kathryn and Lisa, for joining me today as panelists. You know, the office was established in 2021, like you mentioned, and it was funded with $250 million ARPA dollars to help to solidify and expand violence prevention infrastructure throughout the entire state of Illinois. For so long, you know, we had practitioners of violence prevention services have to use supplemented dollars. They've had to use workforce development dollars. They've had to use reentry dollars, which are already little to nothing youth employment dollars in order to do a lot of the work that we've been doing, organizing, outreaching, engaging with victims and perpetrators over the years. So the office was set up to provide some continuity of funding, as well as to provide dollars for infrastructure. So over the last 2.5 years, we've invested over $220 million in 26 communities in the city of Chicago that have been the hardest impact, as well as 14 different municipalities throughout the state, to continue on and to scale some of the efforts that we've seen. And we're excited about the work because, you know, I think one of the lasting legacies of the project is that, you know, we had 3 years to invest this money because there are ARPA funds. And in those 3 years, we've been able to fund over 170 grantees, and over 60 of which are first-time state awardees. They've never done business with the state of Illinois before. Building capacity on the ground very, very quickly in violence prevention and building that infrastructure has allowed for these dollars to flow through. And I'm hoping that, you know, the infrastructure that we've built and the investments we've made, we can sustain in order to really get to the root of this public health crisis. So.
And Quiwana, can you tell us how that looks like? Like, is the money going to these organizations on the ground? Like, what does that look like for these communities? What, for people who, you know, maybe live in these communities where there's a little bit more gun violence, you know, what does that look like? You mentioned that this money is being spread out in different communities. Can you just elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, so the point was to really impact those areas that are hardest hit. And so we did a deep dive into which communities, looking at a per capita basis, have experienced more firearm victimizations. And what our research has delivered to us is 26 communities throughout the city of Chicago that we should focus on, in 14 different municipalities throughout the state. And the Reimagined Public Safety Act is pretty prescriptive in the way it lays out how those dollars should be expended. And the main strategy that has been used in RPSA funding is something called CBI, which we're all familiar with. We were able to scale CBI with over 100 different violence prevention organizations throughout the state. We also fund youth interventions. We also fund trauma behavioral health services. We also fund capacity building, because we know, as mentioned before, we want to make sure that the strategy remains hyper-local, right? So that people who have the genuine and authentic relationships on the ground are the ones who are actually doing the work and engaging with people in community. And so in order to do that, we understood that we needed to have some capacity building services available for grantees who have never done business with the state of Illinois, don't understand what GATA requirements are, and that may need a little back office support. So we expended funds across the gamut, but the majority of the money went to, about 75% of which went to specifically CBI and CBI plus strategies. So when I say CBI plus, so CBI means like the traditional street outreach by people with lived experience. It includes victim services, as well as wraparound case management supports for vulnerable populations. But we also expanded into something that we call Flip 2.0 or Peacekeepers, which is an enhanced CBI strategy, which looks at how do we engage with those people who have lived experiences, who do have trusted relationships on the ground, train them, provide stipends, somewhat like a transitional type job for some people who may have never worked before, but who have those relationships, and then mediate conflicts on the ground in hotspot areas around the city. And so we've engaged in those strategies with a couple of our partners, who then expanded to many other partners across the city. And so so that we can have a comprehensive array of services that we can offer.
And Lisa, what are your thoughts? As someone who advocates for second chances, are there misconceptions about how those are impacted respond to violence? Sorry, can't hear you.
No worries. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Repeat that question for me, Joanna.
So as someone who advocates for second chances, are there misconceptions about how those who are impacted respond to violence?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are a great deal of misconceptions. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that that's all the survivor community wants is permanent punishment. And a survey that was done by the Alliance for Safety and Justice in the state of Illinois in 2016 by survivors of gun violence and by survivors of violent crime, not specifically gun violence or not solely gun violence, but violent crime across the state, brought back results that that's not the entirety of the thought process of individuals who have survived violent crime, that people want to feel safe. And the belief is that, well, the political system, the political agenda would want the survivor community to believe that extensive laws around punishment and different legislation is a driver of safety. And the truth of the matter is that it's not. People are still experiencing longer term prison sentences, based with enhancements and things like that coming into legislation, that still has not reduced the incidence of gun violence or community violence or violent crime that take place. And so longer prison sentences and perpetual punishment, permanent punishment do not promote public safety. And again, as I said before, the survey itself said so, and work with individuals that I've experienced, and I worked with individuals that I've worked with, and my own personal experience. I do not believe that long-term prison sentences impact or have an impact, one, on public safety, and two, on ending violent crime. And I don't believe that that's what the survivor community actually wants.
And I asked Kathryn this question, Lisa, but what does healing look like? How do you guide someone to heal? Maybe someone who's never learned how to heal or even have that conversation of, how does someone start healing?
Well, again, as I said before, there's no one answer. There's no linear approach to healing, and healing looks different for a lot of people. And so I can speak again for me and my experience. For me, healing looked like finding a place where I could live beyond the experience of grieving, which is different from the experience of grief. Grief is is a more inward expression of the loss that I've experienced. However, grieving is a more of an external, a more outward expression of the loss that I've had. And for me, my healing journey began when I learned to I learned to do my outward grieving differently, while accepting my inward experience of grief, because Darren is never coming back. And so that loss will always be there. And that is where I experience grief in my moments of my private time. That's my private, that is my private experience. My grieving experience, again, it looks different. I took on I guess I just began to follow the path where it was more important for me to find the beauty in the life that Darren lived and the legacy that he left behind, and focus a lot less on the one day of his entire life that his life actually ended. I choose to make the rest of my life, or spend the rest of my life focusing on the life that he lived, and not make every moment of every experience of thinking about him about the day that he died.
But I
That's
can
what
imagine
healing.
getting there was very hard.
For me, it was a decision.
Okay.
It's been a process, and it was a decision. And what I really do believe, and we talk about this a lot in the women's group that my organization runs. We talk about this a lot, that all of the work that we talk about begins with a decision on how you are going to move forward. There's a level of empowerment that the survivor community, I don't even think is all fully aware that is available to them. I think that society has this expectation that the grieving process and the grief process are one and the same. And that is what is taught, I think. And what we do in the I Am Enough Women's program is we teach about the layers of trauma. We teach what oppressive trauma is and what historical trauma is, and we and what complex and disenfranchised grief looks like, in specifically amongst women of color. And we talk about that, and therein, and then we also share that there's room to make a decision about what your process looks like. And I don't think that a lot of women I don't think that a lot of people are even aware of that we just have to just be, kind of clothed in sackcloth and ashes for the duration of our particular experience, because we've had this one major loss. And the truth of the matter is that we don't.
I interview many people parents who've lost loved ones, and recently I've interviewed a mother, and she lost her son last year. And I mean, she is very much in that grieving process, and we talked almost every week, and it's almost, I feel devastated for her on how to guide her, or I just listen, because it's so hard. She feels like this real emptiness in her soul of how to continue to keep going when your son is not there anymore, your loved one's not there anymore. And Kathryn, going to you also have done a lot of research. And I remember when we chatted, you talked about the importance of survivors coming together and having that group setting to be together. Can you just tell us of why that's so important?
Yeah, thank you. And great question. So I want to acknowledge the incredible work that Lisa has done with her women's group because she created an intentional space that's structured in a way to acknowledge the choice and autonomy that survivors have. And I think that the more survivor spaces that follow in that line in Chicago, the better. What I see happening a lot is that survivors are looking for a way to connect with others and meaningfully process their grief, which is an excellent place to start. But then that grief and that desire to connect with others is not always, I would say, responsibly engaged or yielded. Sometimes I see community activists, politicians, and even media pushing a survivor in front of a camera and asking to talk about your experience. And as long as you keep retelling that story, somehow there will be a resolution that comes from it. In actuality, that tends to traumatize survivors more than it helps them unless they've been in an intentional group space. So an intentional group space that has the structured support that Lisa's describing, it first creates a space of safety, a judgment-free zone in which you don't have to explain or try and justify whatever you are feeling because it's mutually experienced and shared within that group. The second part about and the reason I say structured and intentional is that that's the starting place, but where are you ending with that group engagement, right? Is it perpetually retelling your story and never being given the skills or opportunities to reconstruct your life post loss? And that's what Lisa's group does, I think, really beautifully. You create connection, you create a small community of people with a shared experience, and then you thoughtfully and intentionally bring in leaders like Lisa herself, or people with a therapeutic background, people who understand somatic healing, who maybe can lead through some somatic healing exercises, criminal legal practitioners, it could be whoever, but somebody who can connect meaningfully with their experience and provide them with a skill or a tool to be able to process that grief in a way that rebuilds connection with their family members and their community and allows them to move from the place, how Lisa says, like from a place of grief to a place of healing and giving back to the others in the community who may have experienced similar tragedy.
But again, as you both mentioned, it's a journey for everybody. Everyone's experience is different. And Quiwana, I want to go to you. The state, as you mentioned, you talked a bit about the grants to support local groups who are on the ground. Are there legislation or policy efforts that can help beyond that too?
Thank you for that. And just, I so appreciate the commentary from Lisa and from Kathryn. I think about, I have two Black sons raised in the city of Chicago who get on the CTA bus every day. Every day they go outside, I'm scared, I'm nervous. I've met too many moms. When you meet them and something tragic like this happens, it's almost like a twilight zone where every piece of strength they have is being used just to breathe and to exist, because it's just, and I think the tragedy extends because for so many years, it was like no one cared. Or, there's a line I always use from Boys in the Hood. It's a movie that says, either no one knows, no one cares, or don't know what's happening in the hood. It's like, because it's like, when a tragedy happens, it's almost like, well, what was your child into so that this happened? You know what I mean? And then, so it becomes a blame game, and then you don't get the homicide clearance rate. So it's just, and then what happens with that trauma grows and spreads, and it just becomes, And so I'm just so inspired by your story, Lisa, and by the work that you're doing. And Kathryn, I mean, the way that you eloquently just, provide all the insight as to what really happens, right? Because it becomes a news story, sensationalized. And then we have to live in community as moms and as, and we just see this happening over and over again. In terms of what the state is doing. So that's why I'm inspired by this whole aspect. The office was just created in 2021. So this is a new initiative for DHS, right? So And the governor established this office as a result of seeing this as a public health crisis. And in order to get underneath this crisis, we can't stop, right? So we've made some progress in the last 2 years, but we know that with any other public health crisis, you have to get it at the root in order to eradicate it, so that it does not continue to spread and to morph and to shift and to change and to provide more havoc on our communities. And so the Reimagine Public Act is a statute. And I am governed, my office is governed by that statute that has very, like I mentioned before, very prescriptive language around how we work to address firearm violence in these specific communities. And we are looking to just use whatever data we can, right? We know now that there is a federal office of firearm violence prevention and offices that are being set up across the country in different states. Offices of firearm violence prevention. As we look at this and we continue to build this as a public health crisis, and we need federal resources to also address this as a public health crisis. So we are on the forefront advocating as state administrators, as you know, to say that this is not going away. We will not stop until I can, as a Black mama raising Black kids in the city of Chicago, can have the same comfort as letting my kids go to the store as kids who are in other communities who could just walk to the store in peace. And so we have to continue to advocate for, we have to continue to do the research on the field to further professionalize the field, that we have professionals who can actually take on these roles, and hoping that we can even create new workforce opportunities for men and women coming home from prison who live in these communities, who have been victimized by or justice impacted individuals, that they can come back and be a part of the solution. So I think that we are just hitting the tip of the iceberg. I believe we have a long way to go. I think that we've made some progress, but it's going to take all hands on deck from the city, from the state, from county, as well as from federal resources to really get to the root of this problem and to really have some more sustainable solutions for the future.
Lisa, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of cap
and I know you didn't say it right, Lisa. I did the
No, we were right there. We were right there. No. We know.
But it's something like that.
We know what Ice Cube said at the end of that movie. We know what he said.
That's right.
But I wanted to kind of cap what both Kathryn and Quiwana said by sharing a quote that I think I've lived by for many, many years since Darren passed away, because again, building on Kiwana's quote from the end of the movie The Boys in the Hood, I would kind of encompass that by saying Mamie Till Mobley, the mother of Emmett Till, also had something very, very profound to say about the need for us to actually all care about what we are experiencing as a nation. And she said, and I live this. The death of my son has shown me that whatever is happening to any of us anywhere in the world had better be the business of all of us. If you live in Skokie or Winnetka, please don't think that this is not your problem, because that's not a true statement. Somehow, on some level, because the violence that we are experiencing in this country is a public health crisis. And because of that, whether you're impacted by loss directly or whether you are impacted by loss indirectly, meaning the rise in healthcare costs, and insurance costs and things of that nature, all of this is being impacted by the crisis of violence that is happening in this country. And to believe that it is an individual problem that should be managed by those monsters and those thugs that live in those particular communities is the biggest falsehood that could ever possibly exist, because no one is exempt. And it goes back to Cavassier's statement: until we all heal, none of us are safe. None of us are safe, and we have to.
Like there's so many layers to dismantle. Yeah, all of you guys talked about it's a journey. It's going to take time, but it just, it feels what I always hear from people. It can be very overwhelming, right? I mean, we just saw the little girl who died at a family event. We saw the officer who was shot going home. I mean, Kathryn, going to you, how do you have these conversations with your loved ones when they are just like, why is this happening in this neighborhood? Why, how are those conversations look like?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Joanna. And so building off of what Lisa and Quiwana have offered in terms of how this builds from a personal decision to building systems that are more responsive and invested in preventing and intervening in violence. As a researcher, I think looking at the racial and spatial dimensions of what we're talking about is incredibly important. That not, as Lisa said, not all communities have the same experience safety in the same way. There's a huge safety gap across our neighborhoods in Chicago and with the broader Chicago metropolitan area. So I want to commend the city and the state for this really intentional investment in the places where violence is concentrated. When you have a problem as big as as gun violence and all the individuals for both impacted on either side of the barrel, starting in the communities that have been disproportionately impacted, I think is where we start. The city has identified priority areas, the state has identified priority areas for investment. And I also commend the city and the state and the county for thinking about how to sustain those investments and that it's not the short-term injection. So if we're talking about wraparound programming for those actively involved in group-based violence, that's really important. If we're talking about wraparound and sustained programming for those who are coming home so they stay out of our state penitentiaries, that's also incredibly important. So I see an important and promising shift in the way that systems are thinking about this issue and the investment in community, which I think cannot be replaced by any other measure.
Thank you. And Lisa, what's the investment that you would like to see from the line of work that you've been doing, speaking with parents, everything that you've been doing since your son's death? What is an investment that you would like to see?
I think it would have to be a more robust investment around the education on the impact of trauma. First of all, the definition of what trauma is, and there's this kind of misconception. I think when people say trauma, we think about the event. I saw somebody get shot. That was a traumatic experience, and that all of these things that we identify as trauma, when the truth of the matter is trauma is not what happens. It's what happens in the body as a result of the experience. And so there could be so many things that leave a traumatic impact on the person who has had that experience. Kathryn, Dr. Bocanegra has the most beautiful and explicit example, demonstration of what trauma actually is and how it impacts, where she uses the two bowls of water and she pours one bowl of water, and then she pours dye into food coloring into the one, and then it changes it a color. And the fact of the matter is that you will never be able, and that is an example of the brain that has had a traumatic experience. And what happens is that you'll never be able to change that water back to its original state. And that's the example of what the brain experiences. And I think that in so many social service settings, individuals that work with people who have had traumatic experiences are doing so without a full understanding of what trauma really, really is and how it actually impacts the body. And I think everybody that is in the trauma recovery space or calls themselves working in the trauma-informed space or the community, the CBI space, should be required to read the book My Grandmother's Hands by Russ Dominican, that fully outlines what the traumatic experience is on individuals. I'll leave it there for anybody who wants to read it, and how none of us actually come here at a zero level of trauma experience. That trauma is ancestral and it is generational, and it carries from individual to individual to individual, generation after generation after generation. And people that say, well, I don't own slaves, or you've never been a slave, so how do you feel like you have ancestral trauma from a slave? The fact of the matter is that trauma is in my DNA. And what we are seeing in the violence that continues to erupt is DNA ancestral trauma that is embedded in the DNA of those individuals who are committing crimes and committing harm. It's because they have not resolved, they have not reconciled with the trauma that exists in their bodies. And until we do that, until we all heal, none of us are safe.
And also the topic of like, is there enough spaces for people to do that in those communities, right? Is there enough mental or just areas or therapy where they have access to? I mean, even a regular person has such hard access to even find a therapist or find someone for help. So I can't even imagine what it has to be like for these neighborhoods where they can't have access to that. So what do you do?
You know, the resiliency that I've seen in some of the youth that I've worked with in our communities is just astounding. You know, I've worked with young people who've seen their friends brain meet on steps, you know, a day afterwards, and they have to go to school, and then they beat up their truant officer, and then they're like, well, why did Jamal do this? Well, you know, and then they are served in spaces where they don't know how to deal with the trauma either, right? I mean, sometimes it's hard to uncover the trauma, because once it's uncovered, what do you do with it, right? If you don't have the resources to then serve it. And it's just been a gap I have seen across the board, that mental health services, one, just identifying that trauma exists. I meet so many young people that smoke weed day and night, and they like, you know, it just makes me feel better. But so many of these issues are trauma based. And so, you know, I think that we have to continue to build up resources and coordinate. I know at the state, we now have a chief behavioral officer, and we also have a chief officer who's looking specifically at youth behavioral health services across the state and trying to coordinate those resources between the agencies. So DHS does behavioral health services, DMH, you know, we have different sister agencies who also, but figuring out how do we coordinate what resources we have. So a mom who's dealing with a 14-year-old who has substance abuse issues that are maybe brought on through trauma has, you know, knowledge as to where they can go find help. And that's not all coordinated now. We have a lot of work to do to, one, increase those resources, but two, to better coordinate them so that a person seeking assistance can find it in an easier way than it is now. Right now, you know, it's just not all coordinated the way it should be. And I think that is a main goal at DHS and at the state, to be able to do that in a better way.
I think that's really tough. I mean, I remember I was looking for a mental health provider for a family member, and it was just quite devastating to have to call one place, then call another, and, you know, waiting on the line for an hour and feeling that frustration. So I can only imagine for the people who don't have access to that. And talking about those resources, Lisa and Kathryn, are there resources out there that people are not really aware of that they could possibly be using?
Sure. Well, just dovetailing off of some of the conversation around accessing behavioral health services, I want to highlight two great examples of like wraparound trauma responsive behavioral health care that are happening in the city, to let people know that this work is not just an abstract problem that we haven't figured out, that there's some really, really great groundwork happening. So one is the Trauma Recovery Center model. We have an example through the Advocate Christ Trauma Recovery Center, which is a one-stop shop where a survivor of violence can go and receive comprehensive behavioral health care, in addition to case management and community follow-up and community navigation that incorporates their safety concerns. So they're not showing up, because I used to be a therapist for that 1 hour session and then walking out the door going, okay, that was great. Now I'm going back to the same environment, the same stressors, and I have no idea how to cope with all of this. So the Trauma Recovery Center model is brilliant, and I've referred tons of people to Advocate Christ, and I'm really thankful for their existence and the work that they do and their impeccable follow-up. And then a community-based example that I would like to uplift is Centro Sanad, that is working on the southwest side of Chicago. And they are really rooted in culturally responsive practice. They have bilingual clinicians, and they are off the insurance grid. So meaning that if a survivor of violence may be uninsured or underinsured, documented or undocumented, whatever their situation is, they can receive long-term behavioral health care that is trauma responsive and culturally derived in a way that they felt seen and heard. And so those are two examples that I hope are replicated exhaustively throughout the city, county, and state that reflect, I think, the values of like Lisa and Quiwana, which is investing in community, investing in people who understand their community, and building responsive services that get at the root causes of the issues we care about.
Thank you for sharing that, Lisa.
I was just also add that the Trauma Recovery Center, my head just, completely went up and down because we, for the I Am Enough Women's Project, we are actually referring women to the Trauma Recovery Center for post-care after the 16 weeks. We did not want women to have a void after that 16 weeks of coming together and meeting in a group session and learning all of the things that they learned and then just cutting off. And so there's a referral out there for women to continue their therapy either in one-on-one or in group. Not therapy. I mean, not continue therapy because we don't offer therapy, but you understand.
Quiwana, any last thoughts?
No, I just, I am happy that this area, we're continuing to evolve and move forward to what, and we're trying to treat people across the state like they matter. And, and especially in our communities, which has had such heavy impact on gun violence. I'm happy to be in this role and be a part of the solution. So, and I, I'm really inspired by both you, Lisa, and Kathryn, and I hope to be able to continue our conversations offline and more of the work that you do. So.
Same here.
Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate everyone's input.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And that's all the time we have today. Thank you to our panelists, Lisa Daniels, Kathryn Bocanegra, and Quiwana Bell. And thank you to our viewers for participating in today's WTTW's News Community Conversation. Now, feel free to submit any story ideas, topics, and issues that we should be covering. Again, this is part of WTTW's News Initiative, A Safer City, where we are diving deep into the neighborhood crime, neighborhood and public safety as residents, policymakers, and community groups work on addressing this growing issue. And you can find this ongoing coverage at our website at WTTW.com. And keep an eye out for another Chicago Tonight, A Safer City special next month. Again, thank you all. Take care and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.